Hey, I'm Isaac. I've been a photographer since 2006, and last year I started offering my clients videography as an additional service. Now I've only shot about 50 videos so far, but I thought I'd make a little video explaining what my rig setup is because it's been working really well for me. Most of my shoots are two-person crews, so it's my wife or my friend Dan on the B cam with me on the A cam, but about a quarter of the shoots I do are solo, and I'll still have the same two-camera setup where I've got the A cam on the rig set up with audio and the B cam just being a second camera on a gimbal, which I'll show you now. This is my A camera setup, so it's a Fujifilm X-T3, and I usually have the 16 to 55mm zoom lens on there, which I'm shooting this video with, so I've just put the 90mm on here for demonstration purposes. Now for the X-T3, I have the battery grip on all the time because you seem to get about 45 minutes of 4K video per battery, so this gives me a total of 3 batteries, and that means I can do a 2-hour video shoot without having to worry about battery life at all. I just know I've got enough and I can focus on what I'm videoing rather than staring at my battery gauge. From here, I also have this screen out. It feels like it really helps when you're shooting 4K video to just let that heat out. I've shot in the middle of summer in Australia doing long takes, and I've occasionally seen the heat warning light come on, but I've never actually had a problem. It's never overheated or stopped me from doing what I want to do, and we've been on really hot days when I'm just covered in sweat, so I feel like this is all you need to do to prevent overheating. Now I've added the SmallRig Cage, which is this one here. I think it's the 2229, and then this wooden handle. The wooden handle is amazing. Just holding that, it feels so much more stable than if you were just holding the body by itself, and it's super comfortable. The other cool thing about this is I can mount my audio receiver or any other audio equipment on the cold shoe that's part of the handle, and that's really close to the audio port, so I can keep my cabling really neat. I'm not running cables all over the place. One thing I thought I'd like would be the top handle on top, which I did buy and I tried it out, but I felt like when I had the top handle on there, then the monitor on top, this monitor was sitting too high up compared to where the camera was, and I just didn't like this looking up and down. So I much prefer having the monitor directly mounted onto the camera, hot shoe, or onto the cold shoe just above here. That way the monitor is much closer to where the lens is, which I just prefer. So now that top handle has become a side handle that I'll sometimes use, or sometimes I'll leave that off and just shoot like this. Now for stability, this body doesn't have IBIS and my lens isn't stabilized. So if I'm shooting handheld and I want a little bit more stability, I'll just add a camera strap like this one. So I've got the Peak Design clips on here. And I find this is so stable. It gives me that nice handheld look that looks really nice, and I can still move wherever I want. It's not like a gimbal where it's awkward to get into certain places or anything. So this is my normal setup here for how I'd shoot. For audio, if I've just got one person talking, I'll just have an audio recorder mounted directly on here, plugged into the camera, and then I'll just have my Apple headphones coming out to monitor the audio as I'm shooting. I like those because I can just pull them out and let them dangle or chuck them on the ground and not worry about it, whereas if I had big headphones, it'd feel a lot more cumbersome for the type of shooting I'm doing. If I'm doing a two-person interview, then I'll use the Saramonic SR-AX100, which allows you to have 2 audio inputs, and then they become the left and right channels in the video. You also have adjustable volume for each one. One thing I'd recommend you always take on every video job would be a multi-tool. So I've got this SmallRig one here, but any one will do. You just want something that's got like a basic screwdriver type thing in it, as well as any hex keys you need. So I find I'll often tighten up a monitor before each shoot just to make sure it's locked on tight, and also tighten up anything else that I think could go loose, just so I'm feeling confident, because I've had in the past when a handle's come loose mid-shoot and nothing's broken yet, but it just freaks you out. This here is an example of an earlier build I tried before settling on the rig I've just shown you. So what my theory was having a top handle so I can do those low angle shots, and also having these 2 handles here that are spread apart so I can get nice stable footage. The problems I found with this is the only time I actually use this handle is when I'm picking the camera up off the ground. Once I've picked the camera up and I start shooting, I never shoot that way, even though I've seen it works for other people. I also found that even though these 2 grips look like they would be stable, because they're a bit higher than the sensor, any movement I make is actually exaggerated by the time you come down to where the sensor is. So this feels similar to the handles that I just shown you previously, but it actually wasn't anywhere near as stable when you looked at the footage. So I got rid of this, and the other thing I didn't like was how far away the monitor was from where the lens was. So I sort of felt like the camera would be down here, but my eyes would be up here, so I'm exaggerating a bit. But yeah, I much prefer having the monitor closer to the camera body rather than this high. So there's no advantage to this build other than it's easy to pick up. Because I don't have IBIS in the body or optical image stabilization in the lens, I'll usually have the camera strap around my neck when I'm sort of roaming around getting shots for the video. But when I'm shooting the talking head portion of the video, I'll usually just use a monopod. So I just mount the whole rig on there like this. And then shoot the talking head segment there. I find that this gives me the right amount of movement for it to not to be as boring as a tripod shot without being as jittery or anything as a handheld shot. So I've still got a nice movement there to make it a little bit more interesting, and my arms don't get tired because the whole thing holds itself up. So this is how I shoot my talking head or any other static shot. I'll use a tripod if I have to, but I much prefer this because just that tiny bit of movement makes it feel so much better. And it doesn't feel like a monopod when you look at the footage. It just looks like a nice handheld shot. So I really like using the monopod with this setup. This is my B camera setup. So it's another Fujifilm X-T3 with a battery grip, so I just don't have to worry about battery life. And this one often has the 23mm 1.4 lens on there, but we'll change that out for an ultra wide angle or a 35mm f2 when the situation arises. This lens is amazing because it's f1.4, so we get that nice blurry background that my clients seem to really appreciate. And it's also got a relatively short minimum focus distance, so we can get right up close to the action when people are working out or detailed shots of the product we're filming, and it's just always in focus. Like, you don't have to worry about getting too close where it can't focus. Speaking of focus, the one thing that I don't like about this lens is it's one of Fujifilm's older lens designs. So the focus motor isn't quite as good as their newer lenses. So it'll go out of focus a little bit more often than, say, if I'm shooting with the 16-55 or the 90mm or the 35 f2. Now that's not a problem for me because when I'm scrubbing through to grab some B-roll, there's plenty of footage that is in focus, but just be aware this one does go out of focus a little bit more than other Fujifilm lenses. Now this is a Zhiyun Crane 2, but I feel like any gimbal would be fine. What I've added to it is this SmallRig handle. Now this handle is amazing because we can just go into underslung mode like this and it just feels perfectly balanced. So you can see here, I can just balance it with one finger and everything's perfect. And we've got a nice monitor mount here. And then we can come back up for normal shooting. It just works perfectly. I'll show you some of the other setups I've tried with this gimbal previously that I just didn't like as much. This is the dual handle accessory grip for the Crane 2. I'm sure every gimbal on the market would have a very similar accessory. So firstly, what I liked about this setup was having the two hands there made it clearer to know exactly where the gimbal's pointing at any time. I just felt like it was really sort of an extension of my body and I knew exactly where it was facing it and where I was directing it. Unfortunately, that's where the benefits ended because I found it was just putting a lot more pressure on both shoulders than single handling the gimbal. And I also found as soon as you start leaning forward, there was a lot of pressure on your forearms and I didn't get any benefit as far as extra stabilization because of the wider grip. The other downside I found is it was surprisingly a lot harder to get into, say, corners of rooms with something this big than when you're just holding it like this. So I found I just didn't see much benefit of the dual handle grip. So I'm glad I got it and tried it, but I just really never use it. Now, another thing I tried was this single hand grip. The idea being that it wouldn't take up as much space, but just give me a little bit more grip than the gimbal by itself. I just found I personally didn't trust it. It seemed to sort of occasionally come loose, but even when it didn't offer me any additional stabilization or spreading out of the weight to both hands rather than just holding it there. So I found 99% of the time, I just prefer that SmallRig grip I was showing you previously, or just the gimbal by itself, and I don't really use either of these accessories. They were so cheap, I'm glad I bought them to try them out, but I just don't use them. My current audio setup is pretty basic, but it's working for me perfectly. So I started off with a Rode VideoMic Pro, like a lot of people do, and I just had that mounted on camera. The problem with that is I found there was just this low-level hiss the whole time, so the audio was much better than the built-in mic on the camera, but it still wasn't great. So then I got a Rode Link Filmmaker kit, which is the wireless lapel transmitter and receiver. As soon as I got that, just everybody's voice sounded amazing with these wireless mics. I'm wearing one right now for this video, and just, yeah, that's been perfect. 99% of what I shoot for audio wise is people talking. So the lapel mic wirelessly transmitted is just perfect. I previously tried using an audio recorder into a mic to save a bit of money before going the Rode Link kit, but I found it was hard because I couldn't monitor the audio while I was filming and then I'd have to sync in post. So the Rode Link Filmmaker kit was definitely worth it. I'm monitoring as I'm recording so I can tell if there's any problems, and also I don't have to sync up the audio later, which is just a nice little convenience, even though it's super easy to do. Recently I've started filming things with 2 people talking, so I was almost going to buy another filmmaker kit, but instead of that I got the Rode Video Mic Go with the official Rode lapel mic that goes with it. The reason I got this is because often I film people working out or in sort of sporty situations, and the big transmitter pack, which looks like this, would sort of often be bouncing around while people are working out, so having the smaller transmitter on them is definitely a nice thing. I found the audio quality isn't quite as nice on this compared to the Rode Link Filmmaker, so the Filmmaker's my A-cam mic always, and I'll just use this if there's a second person or it's some kind of action where a big transmitter wouldn't be appropriate. Now when I'm shooting 2-person audio, I just use this. This is sort of a more fancy version of a splitter cable. It's the Saramonic SR-AX100, and it just allows you to feed in 2 inputs, and then it has a single output that goes to your camera, so each input goes to either the left or right channel. Now you can adjust the volumes, but 99% of the time I just have them on max volume. It's not battery powered, it's purely passive, so it's not another point of failure where I have to worry about the batteries running out. The only downside of this is it doesn't work with passive microphones. So with a wireless transmitter that's powered, or like a Rode Video Mic Pro, that's perfectly fine. But with this one, which is unpowered, I can't plug this in there and use it. I can plug that directly into the camera, but I can't use it with this. Now, if I want some other sort of sound, I'll use the Zoom H1. There's much better Zooms out there, but I bought this years ago and I haven't outgrown it yet, just for any location sound. I've got the little wind mic for it as well, for if there is wind outside. But yeah, between the lapel mics and this, that's done everything I need. And then for audio monitoring, most of the time I just use these headphones because they pack up so small in my camera bag and they're good enough for me to hear what I want. I'm sure if I was shooting a massive budget movie, I'd have the big cans and pay full attention and everything, but this is fine to make sure there's no clothes rubbing on the mic, or that the volume's loud enough, or there's no background noise. So I've just been using this and it's been great. Finally, there's my lighting. So I try and use natural light as much as possible, just because then I don't have to worry about different color temperatures fighting each other, or shadows, or light stands getting in frame, or batteries running out. But I often do end up using lighting, especially for talking head segments. So my primary video light is the Godox SLB60, which is a battery powered LED light, and it accepts Bowens modifiers. I'm using it right now, so I can't show you it, but it looks very similar to this. So it's got a removable battery, and each battery gives you 1 hour of light at full power, or obviously like 2 hours light at half power. I often use this in either a shoot-through umbrella, which is super simple and just throws light everywhere, or I'll use it with one of my gridded soft boxes like this, which is what I'm using right now. So I love the gridded softbox because it just allows you to control the light. So say for example right now, there's light coming onto me, but it's not hitting the background, so that way it's easy for me to pop out of the background and there's no weird reflections. That reflection back there is actually my window over there. Aside from that, I've also got a couple of little LED lights like this one here. So this is a Aperture M9, which I'm just using to give me a bit of separation from the background. And aside from that, I've got a couple of 300 LED panels, Yongnuo YN300s, which I rarely use anymore, just because I like the control of a grid on this with all the Bowens modifiers that I've got from my photography. Looking into the future, I'll probably get an Aperture 300D Mark II very soon, because the main problem I've got with these is I'll be halfway through a video, like actually it even happened in this video, and the battery will just die. So luckily I've got 2 batteries for these, so I could just swap the battery out and keep shooting, but once the second one dies, I just can't shoot anymore till they recharge, because you can't provide the SLB60 any mains power. Often though, it's a 5 or 10 minute talking head segment, so not having to worry about where power is running or people tripping over cables or anything, the battery power really comes in handy, and it's enough light, even though it's only 60 watts, to light up my subjects just fine. The 2 final accessories that I'd say you definitely want to get if you're doing any videography is a grey card. This one was about $5 off eBay. It's amazing. Whenever I white balance the cameras to this grey card and then shoot F-Log and then add the Eternal Light over the top, the colours and skin tones and everything just look perfect. I don't have to spend any time colour correcting skin tones. The colours just look amazing, and I feel like I can spend all my time making a nice edit, picking the right music and stuff, rather than trying to get colours looking nice. The other thing I'd highly recommend is an external monitor. So both of my rigs have an external monitor, and they aren't cheap, but although you can get cheap ones, and I'm sure they're fine. And I just found as soon as I got the external monitor, I could see everything I was doing so much clearer. So I could see waveforms for when people are talking, I could tell if it was in focus or not. I could really see on that bigger screen if there was something distracting in the background or if the horizon wasn't straight. So it just made my job so much easier, and I also felt more confident while I was shooting because I could see exactly what was going on rather than the tiny little screen on the camera. Now, as for the Fuji itself, I absolutely love it. I've shot with my 5D Mark IV trying to do some video, and I've used a friend's A7 III, and I've also used a friend's C100. The C100 is obviously the most cinema-ready camera, but compared to the A7 III and the 5D Mark IV, I love my Fuji way more for video. The 10-bit files are just amazing, so I have to generate proxies so that I can edit them smoothly in Adobe Premiere Pro on my computer, but it's so worth it because, yeah, I've had video footage that's 2 stops underexposed. I just drag it up and it looks perfect. Or colors where the white balance is really wrong for some reason, and I'll just correct it, and I can't believe how far I could push the footage without it falling apart. I've tried that before on my 8-bit footage on my 5D Mark IV, and yeah, you just couldn't play with the footage anywhere near as much. So if everything was perfect in camera, the 8-bit Canon was all right, but the Fuji I'm just so much more confident shooting with because I know I've got ability to manipulate the footage in post later. So yeah, I can't go back to 8-bit now that I've tasted 10-bit. Other things I love about the Fuji is the 4K 60. There's a tiny crop, I think it's 1.17, but I don't even notice it. And yeah, the footage looks so crisp at 4K 60, it's insane. The 120 FPS at 1080 also looks really good. Obviously nowhere near as good as 4K, but yeah, that looks beautiful. And I also love with the Fuji that there's no sort of tricks or gotchas with anything. I know with the A7 III, if you plug in a HDMI monitor or recorder, you lose face detect. And there's some other tricky things like that. With the Fuji, there's none of that. Just face detect always works, even if you've got a HDMI plugged in. Autofocus always works, even in slow motion, unlike some other cameras. So I just love that I can do everything without sort of having to compromise anywhere. So yeah, I just love it a lot. Thanks guys for watching. This has been my first YouTube video I've ever made, so you could possibly be my first video ever. I've currently got 0 subscribers, but if you want to subscribe, I'd love that. Thanks for watching, guys.